Imagine that you're a Muslim worshipping at the mosque on a Friday. All of a sudden, heavily armed police officers storm your house of worship and force you and other worshippers onto a bus. From there, you're taken to a military recruitment office, given a physical evaluation, and shipped off to an army base. Upon arrival, you're told, enlist or go to prison. This story is an all too real part of life for Central Asian immigrants in Russia. In this video, we're going to talk about the plight of Central Asians under Russian rule. The latter half of the 19th century saw the last major expansion of Russia's territory. Russia during this period was expanding into Central Asia. In its quest for stable and more clearly defined borders, the Russians began acquiring more territory in the region. Centuries had gone by since the region was controlled by one ruler. In the north, Central Asia is mostly steppe, and the south of the region is a desert. Central Asian cities like Samarkand and Bukhara were centers of trade and commerce along the Silk Road of old. At one point, the region was under Persia's sphere of influence. In fact, the ancient settled people in the area were Persian in language and culture. Over time, and especially after the 13th century Mongol invasions, the Tajiks, as these people were called by the Turks, had taken in large numbers of Turkic nomads. The linguistic and cultural roots of the people living in Central Asia were rather diverse. Turkish was used in official government business and in the military. Persian, however, was used for trade, culture, and religion. Uzbeks ruled over most of Central Asia and eventually became more sedentary. Uzbeks and Tajiks of the oases were bilingual and thus became indistinguishable. The Russians referred to them as Sarts, a Sanskrit word meaning merchant. Islam, of the Sunni variety, was adopted by the people of the oases long before the Mongols had arrived. It is interesting to note that Muslim scholar Avicenna or Ibn Sina hailed from Bukhara. Islamic practice in Central Asia became more disconnected from the rest of the world. This was the result of the region's declining global importance as well as Russian expansion and the adoption of Shia Islam by the Persians. Even the Hajj, or pilgrimage to Mecca Muslims are required to make, became more difficult for Central Asian Muslims to perform. The nomadic peoples of Central Asia retained their traditional folk beliefs for longer. These people worshipped the sky deity Tengri and revered holy sites associated with ancestors or natural phenomena. Sufi missionaries carried Islam to the nomads. The missionaries adopted the lives and customs of the nomadic people as a means of gaining their trust. Russia first became interested in the region when a trade route was opened between Tobolsk and Bukhara in the late 16th century. It was not until the 19th century that Russia intervened further when the Khan of Kokand sent troops to disrupt the caravan trade in the region. Armed groups traveled to the steppe to establish forts and entice tribal leaders into siding with Russia. It was in the 19th century that the British and Russians engaged in the quote-unquote Great Game, a power struggle over Central Asia. Russian policy in the region relied on military force, customary for imperial powers of the era. The Khan of Kokand accepted Russian peace terms, calling for an indemnity to be paid to Russia and security for Russian traders in Kokand. Khiva and Bukhara became Russian protectorates as well. After an uprising, the Khanate of Kokand was abolished in 1876. Turkmen tribesmen inflicted a humiliating defeat on the Russians at Geographically in 1879. 2 years later, Russian General Skobelev avenged this defeat by massacring every male in the fortress town of Dengil-Tepe. The Russians did not intend to make their new Central Asian subjects full citizens. Historian Geoffrey Hosking wrote, "They were classified as inorodtsy, or aliens, and Central Asia became a colony in a more or less normal sense. This is, it was geographically cut off from the metropolis by desert and steppe, it had a lower socioeconomic and cultural level, and it provided raw materials, mainly cotton, for metropolitan industries." He continues with, "Russian rule did not at first much affect the religion, customs, and legal systems of the indigenous people of their subjection to Khans and Beks, but tighter integration into the Russian economic system brought considerable changes." Russian immigrants to the newly conquered Central Asian territories established textile mills, constructed irrigation systems, and built railroads. Land was confiscated from the Khans and Beks and redistributed to ordinary tribesmen. Land was also awarded to peasants from poor regions of European Russia. The presence of these Russian-owned farms created tensions between the Russians and the nomads. Russia's government attempted to encourage the local nomads to grow grain and hay as a means of improving the health of their livestock. The Russians curbed feuding between tribes, favoring more economically productive tribes. Authorities also promoted mosque-based Islam as a means of promoting order and economic enterprise. In 1916, the region broke out in revolt against the Russian occupiers. Exemptions from military service for Muslims were rescinded. As draft lists were being drawn up, locals attacked government buildings in the main towns. The Russian military was sent in to restore order. Hundreds of thousands of Muslims fled to China. Nearly 20% of Turkestan's population was lost through either death or migration. Some areas saw even higher levels of depopulation. Once the USSR was established in the 1920s, it was divided into SSRs, or Soviet Socialist Republics, in recognition of the fact that many of the people groups living within it constituted their own national identities. This included the peoples of Central Asia. In the 1970s and 1980s, the Uzbek SSR and its leadership defrauded the central government in Moscow by inflating cotton harvest yields. At one point, the Uzbek SSR accounted for most Soviet cotton production. This inflation of production figures caused a scandal on top of costing the Soviet government millions of dollars. Following the collapse of the USSR in 1991, the Central Asian republics took diverging paths of development. Turkmenistan became a North Korea-esque dictatorship. Tajikistan is the poorest country in Central Asia. Kyrgyzstan is likewise a poor landlocked country. Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan emerged as the major players out of the former Soviet republics in the region. Russia, China, and Iran all maintain interests in Central Asia. The European Union also maintains economic interests in the region as the EU is Central Asia's main trading partner. As a matter of fact, the European Union imports a substantial amount of energy from the Central Asian republics. Of particular importance to us right now is the experience of Central Asians in Russia. According to World Bank figures, remittances, primarily from Russia, make up a third of Tajikistan's GDP. At one point, this number was even higher. Remittances from Russia once made up most of Kyrgyzstan's GDP too. Central Asian immigrants in Russia primarily work in low-skilled, low-wage positions. Over 1 million Central Asians and Caucasians were granted Russian citizenship since 2017. Currently, Central Asian migrants in Russia are being targeted for conscription and subsequent service in Ukraine. Russian government officials have mentioned sending migrant laborers to Ukraine in addition to naturalized Russian citizens. In April 2023, Russian President Vladimir Putin signed a law into effect regarding citizenship. This law does not require foreigners with Russian citizenship to serve in the military. However, the new law does allow foreigners to be stripped of Russian citizenship for spreading misinformation about the war in Ukraine or discrediting the Russian military. This law might soon include mandatory military service given Russia's manpower needs. Central Asians and Caucasians also experience racism and xenophobia from their host society. To add insult to injury, Central Asians are exploited economically and are often without legal recourse since many of them reside in Russia illegally. Russian expansion into Central Asia and the Caucasus presented numerous security risks for the Russian state. The relationship between Russia and the Central Asian republics mirrors that of the Western European powers such as Britain, France, and Portugal and their former colonial possessions. Much like how immigrants from Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean flooded into the cities of their former colonial masters, migrants from the former Caucasian and Central Asian SSRs have inundated their former master Russia. What do you guys think? Do you agree that Russia acted as a colonizer in its own right? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.